Finally giving up diversity hire, Garrett Lawson's voice rang across the sleeping area like a sharp knife-cutting silk. Every word dripped with happiness as he watched Sloane Mercer pack her few things into a military-issued bag. The late afternoon California sun shined through the windows, creating long shadows that made the quiet woman look even more alone. She had become their favorite person to pick on. Travis Keller and Mason Price stood on either side of Garrett, like hungry birds circling their prey. Their matching mean smiles showed they were happy to watch someone finally break under all their pressure. For 3 weeks, they had made Sloane's life a planned nightmare of bullying. And now their mean plan seemed to have worked. Sloane stopped packing. She didn't turn around as she answered in her usual quiet voice. "Some battles aren't worth fighting here." Her voice had no anger or frustration, just the tired acceptance of someone who had learned to pick her battles carefully. She lifted her bag. As she did, her sleeve moved up a bit, showing a small line of black letters tattooed on her left wrist. Commander Hayes happened to be walking past the open door right at that moment. His eyes landed on Sloane's exposed wrist, and his phone dropped to the concrete floor with a loud crack that cut through the quiet afternoon. The experienced officer's face turned pale as he recognized something. His lips moved in a whisper that was barely loud enough to hear, but it would change everything. "We've been looking for someone like you for 18 months. But that shocking moment would come later. 3 weeks earlier, the story had started very differently. The Naval Special Warfare Advanced Training Facility buzzed with nervous energy from new beginnings, as the sun came up over Coronado on a Tuesday morning in September. Salty ocean air mixed with the distant sound of waves crashing on the shore. It was the perfect setting for what would either make or break military careers. The experimental program had brought in candidates from across many military branches. Each one hoped to prove they were worthy of joining the elite group of Naval Special Operations. Sloane Mercer sat quietly in the back row of the welcome meeting room. Her military notebook was open and her pen was ready. She brought this same careful preparation to everything she did in military life. At 28 years old, she carried herself with the quiet precision of someone who had learned that actions spoke louder than words, and that getting attention was often bad for reaching her goals. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect military bun, and her grey eyes had the special stillness that came from seeing more than most people her age should have seen. If you're already interested in Sloane's mysterious calmness and want to see how this story goes, hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing military stories that reveal the truth behind the uniform. According to her official file, she had spent the last 4 years working as a helicopter mechanic for civilian defense contractors. She fixed aircraft used in support operations in different places. It was respectable work that needed technical skills and attention to detail, but it didn't seem like preparation for the tough training program ahead. Most of the other candidates had backgrounds in infantry, reconnaissance, or specialized operations. Sloane's mechanical skills made her different in a group already selected for being exceptional. The 3 men who would become her main bullies noticed this difference right away. Garrett Lawson, a former Marine corporal with huge linebacker shoulders and the kind of aggressive confidence that had helped him in more traditional military settings, made himself the unofficial leader of their group's doubt. His voice carried the authority of someone used to being heard when he spoke. "Look around," Garrett whispered to his friends as Captain Rodriguez began the formal briefing. "See anything that doesn't belong?" His eyes fixed on Sloane, like a hunter spotting the weakest animal in the herd. "Helicopter mechanic, civilian contractor. They're really scraping the bottom of the barrel to fill diversity quotas." Travis Keller nodded in agreement. His pale eyes scanned Sloane with careful judgment. The former Army Ranger had built his reputation on physical threats and the kind of mental pressure that could break weaker soldiers before combat ever happened. Where Garrett was loud and obvious, Travis worked with quiet menace. He made his threats through body language and smart positioning rather than direct confrontation. Mason Price completed their group of 3 with careful precision. He understood that the most effective sabotage happened behind the scenes. His Navy background had taught him the importance of official paperwork and proper procedures, knowledge he planned to use as a weapon against anyone he thought was unworthy of wearing the uniform. Unlike his friends, Mason rarely raised his voice or made grand statements. He preferred to let his actions speak for him, and his actions were always devastating to his targets. Captain Rodriguez commanded the room with the easy authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of service in the most demanding places the military could offer. His weathered face had the kind of scars that came from real combat rather than training exercises. His voice carried the weight of absolute credibility when he spoke to the gathered candidates. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are here because your service records show exceptional potential for advanced special operations work," Rodriguez began. His eyes swept across the room with practiced assessment. "This program will test not only your physical abilities, but your ability to adapt, overcome, and work well as part of a team under conditions that will push you beyond anything you have experienced before." As Rodriguez explained the program structure and expectations, Sloane found herself automatically noticing details about timing. The security rotation changed every 47 seconds. The ventilation system cycled at exact 3-minute intervals. The emergency exits were positioned to allow quick escape while keeping sightlines to potential threats. These observations came automatically, without thinking, the way some people might notice the color of paint on walls or the style of furniture in a room. She didn't realize that her mental cataloging of tactical details was anything unusual. To her, paying attention to environmental factors seemed like basic awareness that any smart person would maintain. The fact that most of the other candidates were focused entirely on Rodriguez's briefing without also mapping their surroundings for strategic advantages didn't seem important to her. When the formal welcome ended, candidates spread out to collect gear and prepare for their first training exercise. Sloane approached the equipment area with the same careful efficiency she brought to all tasks, checking items off her list with the thoroughness of someone who understood that overlooked details could have terrible consequences. That was when Garrett chose to make his move. "What's that supposed to be?" he asked loudly enough to attract attention from nearby candidates, pointing at the small tattoo on Sloane's left wrist that had become visible when she reached for equipment on a high shelf. "Looks like one of those temporary tattoos you get from a grocery store machine." The tattoo was indeed small and somewhat faded. It had what looked like random black letters arranged in a line along her wrist. To casual looking, it might have seemed like decorative body art chosen more for looks than personal meaning. The letters themselves weren't easy to recognize as belonging to any common writing system, giving them an exotic look that could easily be dismissed as fashion rather than substance. Travis moved to stand on Sloane's other side. His closeness created the subtle mental pressure of being surrounded. "Did you get that at some strip mall parlor while you were waiting for your oil change?" His tone had just enough fake concern to give him an excuse while delivering maximum insult. "I hope you at least got a discount for bulk work." Mason's approach was more subtle but equally mean. He made a show of checking his own equipment list while positioning himself to overhear and possibly record any response Sloane might make. His presence created the uncomfortable awareness that anything she said could be taken out of context and used against her. Later, a mental trick that effectively discouraged defensive reactions as Sloane's response was to simply pull her sleeve down to cover the tattoo and continue with her equipment check. She made no attempt to explain or defend the marking. She didn't rise to the obvious bait being offered by her bullies. Her silence seemed to frustrate them, as though they had expected a more dramatic reaction to their teasing. "Strong, silent type," Garrett observed with heavy sarcasm. "That's going to work real well when we need clear communication under pressure." He turned to address the growing audience of candidates who had gathered to watch the confrontation. "Hope you all don't mind carrying extra weight when our diversity hire starts falling behind." The first day's training exercises were designed to establish starting abilities and identify areas needing extra attention. Standard physical fitness tests were followed by basic tactical movement drills, weapons introduction, and teamwork exercises that would form the foundation for more advanced training in the coming weeks. For most candidates, these first challenges represented a chance to show their readiness for the demands ahead. For Sloane, they represented something else entirely. During the obstacle course test, she moved with an efficiency that seemed almost robotic in its precision. Where other candidates attacked barriers with brute force or athletic ability, Sloane approached each challenge as though she was solving a math problem. Her movements were economical, calculated, and devastatingly effective. She completed the course in the third fastest time, despite being neither the strongest nor the most obviously athletic candidate there. More importantly, she completed it without seeming to use maximum effort. Travis noticed immediately. "Lucky run," he announced to anyone within earshot as candidates gathered for post-exercise evaluation. "Probably had someone draw her a map." His dismissive tone made it clear he thought Sloane's performance was somehow fake, an accident rather than a sign of real ability. But Dr. Elena Vasquez, the facility's chief medical officer, had been watching with the trained eye of someone who understood the subtle signs of advanced physical conditioning. Sloane's recovery rate was exceptional. Her breathing patterns suggested training far beyond what would be expected from a civilian contractor. And her movement efficiency showed familiarity with obstacle navigation that could only come from lots of practice. "Interesting," Dr. Vasquez murmured to herself, making a note in her evaluation records that would prove important later. The weapons introduction exercise gave another chance for Sloane's unusual background to show in ways that didn't match her official file. When handed an M4 carbine for basic operation assessment, she took apart and put back together the weapon with the unconscious skill of someone who had done the task thousands of times. Her weapon handling was textbook perfect, but more than that, it was instinctive. Petty Officer Blake, the senior armorer responsible for weapons training, watched her performance with growing curiosity. Civilian contractors might keep basic familiarity with weapon systems, but Sloane showed knowledge that went well beyond maintenance into tactical use. Her sight alignment was perfect, her breathing control was automatic, and her trigger discipline was excellent. "Where did you train?" Blake asked quietly as Sloane completed her assessment. "Various places," Sloane replied, offering no extra detail. Blake nodded, filing away his observations for future reference. In his experience, people who avoided questions about their training background usually had good reasons for keeping quiet. The quality of those reasons became clear later through performance rather than explanation. Mason had been watching the exchange with hunting interest. After Blake moved on to assess other candidates, Mason approached Sloane with the kind of helpful expression that hid hostile intent. "Nice shooting," he said with apparent sincerity. "Mind if I ask what kind of civilian training program teaches tactical weapon handling at that level? I might want to recommend it to some friends." Sloane's response was to focus on cleaning her weapon with careful attention to detail. "Standard contractor requirements," she said, without looking up from her work. "Right," Mason replied, his tone suggesting he found her explanation less than convincing. "Standard contractor requirements." That evening, as the candidates settled into their assigned rooms and began preparing for the weeks ahead, the three men, who had made themselves Sloane's main opposition, gathered to compare notes and plan their next moves. Their room had become an unofficial headquarters for what they saw as a necessary campaign to maintain program standards. "She's hiding something," Mason stated with absolute certainty. "Nobody gets that good with weapons from civilian contractor work. Either she's lying about her background or she got training she's not supposed to have." Travis leaned back against his bunk, thinking about tactical options. Could be stolen valor. A lot of people claim military experience they never earned. Might be she's hoping nobody checks too carefully. Garrett cracked his knuckles with happy anticipation. "Then we need to check carefully. Real carefully. Can't have frauds making the rest of us look bad." Their plan took shape over the next few days, as they watched Sloane's continued performance in various training situations. She regularly showed abilities that seemed inconsistent with her stated background, but she did so quietly, without fanfare or apparent desire for recognition. This restraint made their task more challenging, as they couldn't simply point to obvious showing off or attention-seeking behavior as proof of deception. Instead, they would have to create situations that forced her to reveal either her limits or her true abilities, either of which could be used to, justify her removal from the program. The chance came during the second week's advanced navigation exercise. Teams were assigned complex routes through challenging terrain with specific timing requirements and checkpoint goals. The exercise was designed to test not only individual navigation skills, but also leadership abilities and team coordination under pressure. Failure could result in immediate dismissal from the program. Sloane found herself assigned to a team that included all three of her enemies, a development that struck her as suspicious but unsurprising. Military training programs often created challenging group situations on purpose as part of evaluating how candidates handled personal conflict while staying focused on the mission. The route began before dawn with teams going into coastal hills under cloudy skies that promised to limit visibility throughout the day. Navigation would rely mainly on compass work and terrain recognition, skills that separated experienced operators from amateur adventurers. The checkpoint sequence required precise timing and coordination, with penalties for early or late arrivals that could snowball into mission failure. Garrett took team leadership without asking anyone. His voice carried the assumption of automatic authority. "I'll take point and handle navigation. Travis, you take rear security. Mason, you manage communications. Mechanic," he added, with deliberate dismissiveness, "you carry extra water and keep up." Sloane accepted the assignment without protest, shouldering the extra weight of emergency supplies while her teammates split the remaining mission-essential gear among themselves. Her silence seemed to confirm their view of her as a weak link who could be pushed to support jobs while the real soldiers handled important responsibilities. They had traveled less than 2 miles when Sloane began to show behaviors that went against their expectations. As the team moved through thick brush, she automatically positioned herself to keep visual contact with both point and rear positions, while constantly scanning for potential threats or obstacles. Her movement was silent, economical, and tactically sound. More importantly, she began making subtle corrections to their route without calling attention to the adjustments. When Garrett led them toward what looked like the most direct path to their first checkpoint, Sloane quietly suggested an alternative route that would add distance but avoid exposed ridgelines. When he dismissed her suggestion with irritation, she simply adjusted her own position to give better watch over the terrain he had selected. 20 minutes later, they ran into the exact type of exposure problem she had anticipated. The ridgeline Garrett had chosen left them silhouetted against the sky for nearly 300 meters, a tactical error that would have been catastrophic in actual combat conditions. Worse, the terrain forced them into single-file movement that eliminated their ability to give mutual support if contacted by opposing forces. Travis, bringing up the rear, was the first to recognize their vulnerability. "We're sitting ducks up here," he called forward in a harsh whisper. "Need to get off this ridgeline immediately." That was when Sloane showed her first clear deviation from expected civilian contractor abilities. Without waiting for orders or discussion, she had already identified and began moving toward dead ground that would give concealment while keeping their general direction of travel. Her route selection was immediate and confident, as though she were reading terrain features from a detailed map, rather than making real-time navigation decisions based on limited visibility. "This way," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone used to making critical decisions under pressure. 200 meters through this draw, then we can parallel the ridgeline under cover until we reach the checkpoint approach." Garrett started to object, his leadership role challenged by subordinate initiative, but Mason cut him off with sharp urgency. "Whatever. Let's just get off the skyline before we fail the entire exercise." They followed Sloane's route through terrain that proved to be exactly as she had described, concealed, tactically sound, and efficient. Her navigation was flawless, despite the fact that she had not been given access to maps or route planning materials. She moved through the landscape as though she had traveled it before, anticipating obstacles and identifying advantages with uncanny accuracy. By the time they reached their first checkpoint 3 minutes ahead of schedule and completely undetected by exercise evaluators, the dynamics of their team had shifted in ways that made Garrett and his allies deeply uncomfortable. "Lucky guess," Travis muttered as they prepared to move toward their second objective. Probably scouted this area during her off time. But Mason was watching Sloane with growing suspicion. Her performance wasn't consistent with lucky guessing or casual familiarity. She showed systematic knowledge of tactical movement principles that went far beyond what any civilian contractor would learn during routine equipment maintenance training. More troubling, she seemed completely comfortable with the high-stress environment of mission-critical navigation under time. Pressure. The second checkpoint required them to cross a shallow river while keeping noise discipline and avoiding detection by roving patrols that were actively hunting training teams. The crossing point was not specified in their mission orders, leaving route selection to individual team judgment. Most teams would likely select obvious fordable areas, making those locations prime sites for evaluator ambushes. Sloane studied the river from concealment for several minutes. Her assessment process was systematic and thorough. She evaluated current speed, depth indicators, bank composition, and approach routes with the careful attention of someone conducting actual reconnaissance rather than training exercise planning. Upstream 200 meters, she announced quietly. Crossing point offers concealment from both banks. Water depth consistent for silent entry and exit. Current speed manageable for equipment protection. Garrett bristled at having his leadership authority taken by technical recommendations from a supposed subordinate. I'll decide where we cross, he declared with sharp emphasis. You just worry about keeping up and staying quiet. The crossing point he selected looked tactically sound from their initial observation position, but Sloane had identified factors that escaped his assessment. The approach required movement through an area that gave excellent watch positions for evaluator ambush teams. The water depth varied unpredictably, creating potential for noise and equipment compromise. Most importantly, the exit route forced them into a natural choke point that eliminated options for rapid withdrawal if contact occurred. They had barely entered the water when the ambush started. Exercise evaluators had positioned themselves exactly where Sloane's tactical assessment suggested they would be, watch positions that commanded the obvious crossing site, with overlapping fields of fire that made escape virtually impossible. Simulated gunfire erupted from multiple positions as the team found themselves caught in the middle of the river with no cover and limited options for response. Contact left, contact right, contact front, Travis called out, his training taking over as he tried to identify threat locations and coordinate defensive actions. But their position offered no tactical advantages and multiple vulnerabilities. The exercise had become a demonstration of what happened when poor planning met skilled opposition. That was when Sloane revealed abilities that definitely exceeded civilian contractor norms. Instead of freezing or attempting impossible defensive actions, she immediately assessed their situation and began executing what could only be described as advanced combat movement techniques. Her voice cut through the simulated chaos with clear, precise instructions that transformed their team from victims into an effective tactical unit. "Smoke now," she commanded, her tone carrying absolute authority that bypassed normal command structure considerations. Travis, suppressive fire on watch positions. Mason, move to dead ground at 10 o'clock. Garrett, follow Mason and establish position for covering fire. As she gave orders, she was at the same time executing movement that showed training far beyond anything available to civilian personnel. Her river crossing became a controlled, tactical advance that used available terrain features for concealment, while keeping the ability to respond to threats from multiple directions. The smoke grenades created temporary concealment that allowed the team to reposition from their exposed location to terrain that offered defensive advantages. Sloane's movement instructions weren't theoretical suggestions, but practical applications of small unit tactics that turned their ambush scenario into a successful breakout engagement. By the time the exercise ended, they had not only escaped the evaluator ambush, but had done so in a way that impressed the seasoned special operations instructors running the assessment. Outstanding tactical movement under pressure, Senior Chief Patterson announced as exercise evaluators came out from their concealment positions. Textbook application of small unit tactics and immediate action drills. Whoever took tactical leadership showed advanced training and excellent decision-making ability. The praise should have been a team victory, but it created an immediate problem for Garrett and his allies. Sloane's performance had been so obviously superior to their own that denying her contribution would seem petty and dishonest. Yet acknowledging her leadership would undermine their entire story about her being an unqualified diversity hire who endangered mission success. Mason decided to address the contradiction directly. "Interesting that our mechanic seems to know a lot about infantry tactics," he observed with apparent casualness. "Must have been some pretty comprehensive contractor training." Sloane was carefully cleaning her weapon. Her attention focused on maintenance tasks, with the same thorough skill she brought to everything else. "Standard emergency procedures," she replied without looking up from her work. "Basic survival skills." "Basic survival skills," Travis repeated, his tone suggesting he found her explanation inadequate. "Right. But Dr. Vasquez had been monitoring radio communications throughout the exercise, and her trained ear had detected elements in Sloane's voice patterns that suggested experiences beyond what appeared in her official file. The tactical terminology Sloane used was precise and current. Her stress responses during simulated combat showed familiarity with actual threatening situations. Most importantly, her leadership during the crisis had been instinctive and effective in ways that came only from practical use under genuine pressure. Medical evaluations scheduled for Thursday, Dr. Vasquez told Sloane as the team returned to base. Routine assessment, nothing unusual. The appointment would prove to be anything but routine. Meanwhile, Garrett and his allies spent their evening debriefing and developing a new approach to their campaign against what they saw as Sloane's fake presence in their program. Her tactical skill made direct attacks on her military abilities counterproductive, but it also raised questions about the accuracy of her stated background that could be exploited through official channels. "Nobody gets that good at small unit tactics from civilian contractor work," Mason stated with absolute certainty. "Either she's lying about her background, or she got training through unofficial channels. Either way, she doesn't belong here." Travis nodded agreement, his mind already working through possibilities for exposing what he saw as deception. Medical evaluation might reveal training injuries consistent with advanced military service. If her file doesn't match her physical conditioning, that's proof of falsified records. Garrett's approach was more direct. "Or we make sure her performance starts matching her supposed background. Put enough pressure on her, and she'll either reveal what she's hiding or crack under the strain." Their plan would require careful coordination and institutional support, but they had 3 weeks of credibility building to draw on. Their own performance had been solid, if unspectacular, establishing them as reliable team members who could be trusted to give accurate assessments of their colleagues' abilities and character. The medical evaluation took place on a Thursday morning that dawned clear and cold, with wind carrying the salt smell of ocean waves across the training facility. Dr. Vasquez had scheduled the appointment for early in the day before training exercises started, allowing for comprehensive assessment without the distractions of ongoing program activities. Sloane arrived right on time. Her appearance reflected the same attention to detail that characterized everything else about her military bearing. Her uniform was regulation perfect. Her physical conditioning was obviously excellent, and her behavior suggested the calm confidence of someone comfortable with medical examinations. Dr. Vasquez began with standard questions about medical history, previous injuries, current physical condition, and any factors that might affect performance during intensive training. Sloane's responses were complete and professionally appropriate. But Dr. Vasquez noticed that she gave minimum necessary information without volunteering extra context that might illuminate her background. "Any previous injuries that required extended medical treatment?" Dr. Vasquez asked while reviewing Sloane's written medical history. "Minor training accidents," Sloane replied. "Nothing that compromised long-term capability," Dr. Vasquez noted the phrasing. Training accidents was military terminology that civilian contractors rarely use to describe workplace injuries. The distinction was subtle, but important to someone familiar with how different communities described similar experiences. The physical examination revealed additional inconsistencies between Sloane's official background and her actual physical condition. Her muscle development was consistent with years of intensive physical training that went well beyond what would be required for helicopter maintenance work. Her cardiovascular conditioning was exceptional, suggesting regular participation in demanding aerobic activities. Most importantly, she had several small scars that looked consistent with medical procedures rather than industrial accidents. "This scarring pattern on your left shoulder," Dr. Vasquez observed while conducting her examination, "appears consistent with surgical intervention. Can you describe the circumstances?" Sloane's response was immediate and seemingly honest. Equipment malfunction during training exercise required minor surgical repair. But her explanation raised more questions than it answered. The scarring suggested surgical techniques typically used for treating combat-related injuries rather than industrial accidents. The positioning showed trauma that would be consistent with ballistic impact or explosive fragmentation, not mechanical failure of helicopter maintenance equipment. Dr. Vasquez made detailed notes but didn't press for extra information during the examination. Her professional experience suggested that Sloane was hiding significant elements of her medical history. But the reasons for such hiding might be legitimate and related to security considerations rather than deceptive intent. "Clean bill of health," Dr. Vasquez announced as the examination ended. No medical factors that would compromise training performance or safety. But privately, she started a discreet inquiry into Sloane's background that would eventually connect with Commander Hayes' investigation and lead to the revelation that would change everything. As the weeks went on, the pattern of Sloane's exceptional performance and her opponent's escalating harassment began to attract attention from training staff who were paid to notice such things. Her tactical skill was undeniable, but so was the growing hostility directed toward her by Garrett and his allies. The breaking point approached as training exercises became more demanding and the pressure to identify weak links intensified. Sloane continued to excel at every challenge while keeping her characteristic silence about her background. Her opponents grew increasingly desperate to find ammunition they could use to justify their assessment of her as unqualified and dangerous. That ammunition came in the form of fake evidence that Mason created with the careful precision that had made him good at administrative warfare. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. Create paperwork that suggested Sloane had compromised equipment security, then let the investigation reveal whatever inconsistencies existed between her performance and her stated background. The plan required careful timing, credible evidence, and institutional support from training staff who trusted their assessment of candidate reliability. All of these elements seemed to be falling into place as the third week of training drew toward its end. Now, what do you think drives someone to fake their own identity in elite military training? Share your theories in the comments below about what Sloane might be hiding. On a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, his candidates prepared equipment for the next day's advanced tactical exercise. Mason executed the first phase of his plan. He placed a small recording device in Sloane's gear bag, positioned to suggest she was conducting unauthorized surveillance of training activities. The device was sophisticated enough to seem legitimate while being obvious enough to be discovered during routine security inspections. The discovery came exactly as planned during Wednesday morning equipment inspection. Senior Chief Patterson found the device while doing his standard pre-exercise security sweep, a procedure that was routine, but took on special meaning when it revealed potential compromise of training. "Protocols, whose gear bag?" Patterson demanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made experienced operators stand straighter. "Mine." "Senior Chief," Sloane replied immediately, her response automatic and professional. Patterson held up the device for everyone to see. Its presence represented a serious violation of training security that could result in immediate dismissal and potential legal action. "Care to explain how this ended up in your equipment?" Sloane examined the device carefully. Her expression suggested recognition, but not surprise. No explanation, Senior Chief. I accept responsibility for items found in my gear. Her response was textbook military bearing under bad circumstances, but it also eliminated any possibility of mounting a defense against what looked like clear evidence of wrongdoing. By accepting responsibility without trying to establish innocence, she had confirmed the apparent violation while giving no information that could be used to investigate the actual circumstances. Patterson's expression suggested professional disappointment, rather than anger, the reaction of someone who had hoped for better from a candidate who had shown exceptional promise. Report to Captain Rodriguez immediately. This matter requires command attention. As Sloane gathered her gear and prepared to face what looked like the end of her military career, Garrett exchanged satisfied glances with his allies. Their campaign had finally achieved its intended goal through methods that seemed completely legitimate and justified by actual evidence of wrongdoing, but they had made a critical error in their assessment of Sloane's background and the attention their harassment campaign had attracted from senior personnel who had information they lacked. The meeting with Captain Rodriguez took place in his office overlooking the training facility, where morning sunlight streamed through windows that offered a view of obstacle courses and firing ranges where future special operations personnel learned to become something harder than they had been. Before, Rodriguez sat behind his desk, examining the evidence while Sloane stood at attention, waiting for judgment that seemed inevitable and final. "This is serious misconduct," Rodriguez began, his tone reflecting the gravity of security violations in military training environments. "Recording devices are strictly prohibited, and unauthorized surveillance of training activities represents a fundamental breach of trust." Sloane's response was immediate and unwavering. "I understand, sir. I accept full responsibility." Rodriguez studied her carefully, noting the difference between her exceptional performance record and the apparent evidence of wrongdoing. Something about the situation felt wrong, but he had clear evidence and a candidate who was accepting responsibility without trying to mount any defense. "Your performance has been outstanding," he continued, his voice suggesting genuine regret. "This incident is particularly disappointing because it comes from someone who showed real promise for advanced operations." What Rodriguez didn't mention was the discreet inquiry he had started into Sloane's background following reports from Dr. Vasquez and other training staff who had noticed inconsistencies between her official file and her demonstrated abilities. That inquiry had not yet produced results, but it had raised enough questions to make him reluctant to take immediate action without extra investigation. "I'm suspending you from training pending full investigation," Rodriguez announced. "You're confined to quarters until this matter is resolved." Sloane accepted the suspension with the same professional behavior she brought to everything else. "Understood, sir. Will there be anything else?" "That depends," Rodriguez replied, his tone suggesting that possibilities remained open despite the apparent evidence against her. "Is there anything about your background or qualifications that might be relevant to this investigation?" The question hung in the air like an invitation for Sloane to give information that could change the path of her case. She had been given a chance to reveal whatever she was hiding, to trust in the military justice system's ability to distinguish between appearance and reality. Her response would determine not only her own fate, but also the consequences that would eventually fall on those who had orchestrated her downfall. "Some truths aren't mine to tell, sir," she said quietly, her words carrying weight that Rodriguez recognized but couldn't yet interpret. "The investigation will reveal whatever it needs to reveal." As Sloane left his office to begin what looked like her final day at the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility, Rodriguez reached for his phone to speed up the background inquiry that had already begun. Something in her behavior suggested that the truth would be more complex than the evidence showed, and he was beginning to suspect that justice might require more investigation than seemed necessary. By late afternoon, Sloane was packing her few belongings into a regulation duffel bag, while Garrett and his allies watched from the doorway with unconcealed satisfaction. Their campaign had achieved complete victory through methods that seemed entirely legitimate and justified by documentary evidence. They had successfully eliminated what they saw as an unqualified candidate who had threatened the integrity of their training program. The moment when Commander Hayes walked past and noticed her exposed wrist was still hours away, but the foundation for that revelation had been laid through weeks of careful observation